A small blade of black volcanic glass was found at Zhokhov, a prehistoric site in the high Arctic. It reached that site roughly 8,000 years ago. The nearest known geological source lies about 1,500 kilometers away. There is no evidence of coins, written contracts, or a formal market linking those two places. Moving the stone directly would have required time, food, energy, and exposure to danger. Yet the blade arrived. So how did people exchange objects across such distances before coins and formal markets? The easy answer is barter. One person brings stone, another brings food, hides, or tools. They swap, then walk away. But archaeology cannot begin with that story. A distant object proves that either the object or the person carrying it moved. It does not automatically prove that a trade occurred. The final user might have collected the material personally. It might have been picked up during seasonal travel. A family carrying it could have migrated. A traveler might have transported it without exchanging it. Or it might have passed through several communities before reaching its destination. To decide among those possibilities, archaeologists ask 3 questions. Where did the material come from? What stage of manufacture had it reached when it arrived? And which explanation best fits the distance, quantity, and traces that remain? Obsidian is unusually useful because different volcanic sources contain distinctive combinations of chemical elements. Researchers can compare an artifact with geological samples and identify the source that most closely matches its chemical signature. That answers the first question. The second question comes from the manufacturing sequence. Raw obsidian normally begins as a nodule with a rough outer surface. Toolmakers remove that surface, strike flakes from a core, shape usable pieces, and leave behind debris. If a site contains raw nodules, outer surfaces, cores, large flakes, and early waste, the material probably arrived before most of the work was done. If the site contains only small blades or finished pieces, while the raw stone and early waste are missing, then much of the production happened somewhere else. This difference does not reveal a transaction by itself, but it changes which explanations remain plausible. One of the earliest important cases comes from the Olorgesailie basin in southern Kenya. At sites dating to roughly 295,000 to 320,000 years ago, people were obtaining obsidian from several directions. Some known sources were approximately 25 to 50 kilometers away. The material was not represented by one isolated object. Archaeologists found cores, matching pieces, and extensive manufacturing debris. People were repeatedly bringing non-local obsidian into the basin and working it there. That is strong evidence for long-distance, multi-source acquisition at an unexpectedly early date. It is not, however, proof of trade. The same evidence that makes Olorgesailie impressive also keeps direct collection alive as an explanation. Because early stages of production occurred at the site, the users may have carried raw or partly worked material back themselves. They could have made dedicated trips. They could have collected it while moving through a wider hunting range. They could also have received some of it from other groups. The evidence confirms movement across distance. It does not determine which social mechanism caused that movement. So the first ruling is clear but limited. At Olorgesailie, long-distance acquisition is established. Exchange is possible, but direct procurement has not been ruled out. This matters because prehistoric exchange is often described through a simple sequence: first barter, then money, then markets. Economic anthropology does not support that as a universal path. Immediate barter is one form of exchange. Two people can trade different goods at the same moment and end the transaction with no future obligation. But exchanges can also remain unfinished. A gift can create an expectation of return. Food given during one shortage may be answered during another. Relatives may move resources without calculating an exact price. A useful object may settle an earlier obligation or begin a new one. The absence of coins does not mean the absence of value, memory, or accounting. It means that value may be measured and enforced through relationships rather than a standardized unit. The archaeological record rarely preserves those relationships directly. It can, however, show when an object becomes increasingly difficult to explain as the result of personal collection. That is what happens at el-Hemmeh in present-day Jordan. Researchers examined 18 obsidian artifacts from the pre-pottery Neolithic settlement. Obsidian was exceptionally rare there, representing about 0.06% of the analyzed chipped stone assemblage. Chemical analysis connected the material to Eastern Goluda, in central Anatolia, more than 900 kilometers away. The distance alone is striking. The condition of the material is more important. No raw obsidian nodules were found at el-Hemmeh. Only one artifact clearly retained part of its natural outer surface. The assemblage consisted mainly of small pieces that had already passed through earlier stages of production. This pattern differs sharply from Olorgesailie. At Olorgesailie, people had enough material and enough early-stage debris to show that substantial production occurred at the destination. At el-Hemmeh, the raw beginning of the process had almost disappeared. That makes a direct journey by the final users less convincing. Traveling more than 900 kilometers to obtain obsidian, then returning with only a tiny amount of already reduced material, would be possible, in principle. It is simply not the explanation that best fits the surviving pattern. Indirect movement fits better. The obsidian may have left the source region as raw or partly worked material. One community could have used some of it, reduced it further, and passed a smaller portion onward. The next community could have repeated the process. By the time a few pieces reached el-Hemmeh, the heavy nodules and most of the early waste had been left far behind. That does not prove a particular route. It does not tell us whether the material moved overland, through coastal connections, during seasonal gatherings, or in the possession of unusually mobile travelers. It does not reveal how many communities were involved. But the combination of extreme distance, very low quantity, and missing early production stages makes transfer through intermediaries more persuasive than direct collection by the final users. At el-Hemmeh, absence changes the balance of the argument. Missing nodules matter. Missing cores matter. Missing early waste matters. They do not prove trade on their own. Together, they show that the people using the obsidian received it after much of its earlier history had already taken place somewhere else. The second ruling is therefore stronger than the first. At el-Hemmeh, direct procurement becomes a weaker explanation. Indirect transfer through other people becomes more likely. The specific route and the form of exchange remain unknown. The case from Zhokhov pushes the same logic much farther. Archaeologists recovered 79 obsidian artifacts there. 59 were microblades. Obsidian made up only about half of 1% of the total stone tool assemblage. The source was approximately 1,500 kilometers away. Again, the distance is only the beginning. Zhokhov lacked large obsidian tools, it lacked obsidian cores, it lacked rough outer surfaces, and the debris created during the earliest stages of manufacture. What arrived was mostly the later part of the production sequence, small, usable pieces that could be inserted into tools and used alongside more common local stone. The obsidian was not confined to an obvious ceremonial object. It entered the practical tool system. That suggests a small flow of usable material rather than the arrival of one spectacular treasure. Researchers therefore consider a direct procurement journey by the final users unlikely. A long-distance exchange network provides a stronger explanation. But even here, the evidence does not justify a story about one prehistoric merchant crossing 1,500 kilometers. There is no preserved list of stops. No road can be reconstructed from beginning to end. No evidence identifies professional traders. The material could have moved in shorter stages, through several communities, across multiple seasons, or over a much longer period. The landscape was also different. Early Holocene coastlines did not match the modern map, and seasonal ice, rivers, and open ground may have altered possible routes. The third ruling is the strongest, but it still has limits. The source and distance are established. Direct procurement by the final users is not the best explanation. A long-distance network of indirect transfer is more consistent with the evidence. The exact route, number of intermediaries, and terms of exchange remain unknown. That leaves the other half of the title. If objects could pass through several groups, what kept the chain moving without coins, written contracts, or a formal market? There are two basic ways an exchange can end. In an immediate exchange, both sides give and receive at once. Once the transfer is complete, the relationship may end. In a delayed exchange, the relationship remains open. Someone gives now and receives later. A gift creates an expectation. Support in one season may be returned in another. The exact return does not have to be identical, immediate, or expressed as a fixed price. Such systems require no coin, but they do require social conditions. People must expect future contact. Past behavior must be remembered. Refusing to respond must carry some future cost, whether through damaged reputation, reduced access, exclusion from later exchanges, or weakened relationships. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer communities show that sharing and reciprocity can move resources among households, reduce some forms of risk, maintain cooperation, and transmit information through social networks. Those modern cases are not recordings of what happened at Olorgesailie, el-Hemmeh, or Zhokhov. The prehistoric communities may have organized exchange in very different ways. The studies establish only that humans can sustain resource movement without settling every transaction immediately through standardized currency. That distinction is essential because a stone can preserve movement and manufacture, but it cannot preserve a promise. It cannot tell us whether it was a gift, a direct swap, an inheritance, a marriage-related transfer, repayment for earlier help, or something that does not fit any modern category perfectly. The strongest conclusion must therefore come from the pattern shared by the archaeological cases. Place them side by side. At Olorgesailie, obsidian traveled roughly 25 to 50 kilometers from several sources. Early production stages remained visible. Direct collection by the users was still plausible. At el-Hemmeh, the distance exceeded 900 kilometers. Obsidian was extremely rare, and the raw material and most early production evidence were missing. Indirect transfer became a stronger explanation. At Zhokhov, obsidian traveled about 1,500 kilometers. The assemblage consisted mainly of small, later-stage products. Cores, rough surfaces, large pieces, and initial waste were absent. Direct procurement became unlikely, and a long-distance exchange network became the best supported interpretation. These are not 3 steps in one continuous historical progression. They come from different places, periods, and societies. They demonstrate 3 different levels of archaeological inference, and that produces the central reveal. Archaeologists do not prove prehistoric exchange by finding one distant object. They build the case by tracking what disappears from that object's manufacturing history. As distance increases and the raw nodules, outer surfaces, cores, and early waste vanish from the destination, the claim that the final users personally collected and processed the material becomes harder to maintain. The exchange itself remains invisible, but the competing explanations do not remain equally strong. One by one, they lose support. An exchange network becomes the better answer not because archaeology has preserved the transaction, but because indirect transfer explains the remaining evidence more successfully than direct acquisition does. That is also where the evidence must stop. Archaeologists can often identify a geological source. They can estimate distance, count artifacts, and reconstruct parts of the manufacturing sequence. They can show that some materials arrived early in production, while others arrived as small prepared pieces. They can judge whether direct procurement is relatively plausible. What they usually cannot recover is the price, the spoken agreement, the item given in return, the number of intermediaries, or the social meaning of the exchange. Even the word money requires care. Money is not limited to metal coins. Shells, beads, and other objects have served as media of exchange, stores of value, or units of calculation in different societies. So the period before coins was not necessarily a period before every possible form of money, nor was it a world governed by one universal barter economy. Before standardized coins and formal markets, objects could cross social boundaries in several ways at the same time. People collected some materials themselves. Some objects traveled with migrating individuals or families. Travelers carried items between communities. Groups met periodically. Immediate exchanges settled some needs at once. Gifts and delayed reciprocity kept other relationships open. Relatives and allies moved resources through continuing obligations. And some materials passed through a sequence of communities until they reached people who may never have met anyone living near the original source. That is the clearest answer the evidence allows. Humans traded before coins and formal markets through a mixture of direct acquisition, movement, immediate exchange, gifts, reciprocity, and indirect transfer. No single system explains every society or every artifact. The archaeological challenge is to determine when an object was simply carried, and when its distance, scarcity, and missing production history make an exchange network the stronger explanation. The small obsidian blades at Zhokhov cannot tell us who carried them, what was given in return, or how many hands they passed through. But their chemical source, extraordinary distance, low quantity, and late manufacturing stage show that the material moved far beyond the normal reach of one local camp. Coins did not create exchange. Formal markets did not create long-distance connection. They later standardized parts of a much older and more varied human process for moving objects between people. The transaction is gone. The exact route is incomplete, but enough remains in the stone to show how exchange could operate before coins and formal markets, not as one primitive barter system, but as overlapping networks of movement, direct collection, gifts, reciprocity, and indirect transfer.